no, you're not crazy. There is a lot of Mormon true crime. And today we're going to be talking about a story that is epic enough that it made it to Netflix and Peacock. Now, you may think that you know this story, but if you don't know Mormonism, I assure you, you do not know this story at all. Now, I do my best to tell these stories in a way, on the podcast at least, that's safe for the Mormons, verifiable enough for the ex-Mormons, and compelling enough for the never Mormons. Now, will you commit to like, rate, review, subscribe, and interact with this video or podcast on whatever platform you're viewing it on or listening on? And that would really make the angel with the flaming sword so happy. So thank you from me and the angel with the flaming sword. Now, if you are somebody who paid attention to the pop culture phenomenon of Game of Thrones, you know the phrase, chaos is a ladder. Chaos is a ladder. This is a phrase that started, the top TV show of our modern time. And the entire storyline is pushed by utter chaos, by a man who strategically creates chaos. And that's what this story is as well. Now, here's one of the things about chaos. Chaos is a lot of times driven by being able to divide and conquer. And creating shame is one of the best ways to divide and conquer. So if you can create chaos through shame, you can become a puppet master. Puppet masters often have really big personalities and they're very persuasive. They draw people in and they control them. That's what happened to the Brobergs. Now, I've had the really wonderful opportunity of talking with Jan Broberg, she is the main subject of today's story. And Jan does not blame the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints for what happened to her. She said that a lot of her members of her community, her ward, they were extremely helpful and supportive and very good to her about what happened. So that's Jan's take on that. She blames the puppet master. And if you saw Abducted in Plain Sight on Netflix, well, when I talked to Jan, she said, Abducted in Plain Sight, like they told what happened, but not really. And that's why I went and I watched the Peacock version, A Friend of the Family, which Jan actually was one of the producers for. And this 9-episode series, it's a live, retelling of the story, and it's really meaningful. So if you think you knew that story from Abducted in Plain Sight, I assure you, you do not. So our story begins in January 1972, and there was the Broberg family. The Broberg family, it was Bob, Marianne, Jan, Karen, and Susan. This family of 5, they went to church just like they did every week, and they ended up meeting the Berchtold family. The Berchtolds also had 5 people, and they were all about the same age. There was a best friend for everyone. And so the Berchtolds and the Brobergs became close quickly. Now, in order for you to understand the significance of this, we're going to jump into some Mormon theology and culture. In Mormon theology, there's this idea that there's a premortal existence where we all lived and existed as our spirit selves, as the children of God, before we came to this earth. And as children of God, that meant that we were all siblings, right? Brother and sister. And so ward families in Mormonism and just people within Mormonism just naturally feel like a tight-knit community. They call each other brother and sister. And so when it came time for the Brobergs and the Berchtolds to become close, there was Bob and Gail in the Berchtold family, and you might remember Bob and Marianne in the Broberg family. So we have 2 Bobs. And so somehow it got to the point where everybody started to call Bob Berchtold B. So I'll just be referring to him as B from here on out. So all of the kids would start to call Bob Berchtold B, Brother B. So Brother B was somebody that everybody loved. He was very naturally charismatic. Everybody felt safe and comfortable. He felt like he was everybody's best friend. And so the Berchtolds and the Brobergs, like I was saying, they started to do everything together because there was a best friend for everyone. And B became like an uncle. And he would just walk in the house without knocking. And their families did literally hundreds of activities together. B started to pick up the kids after school for Marianne so that, she didn't have to go out. He was already out working at the furniture store that he owned. So he would pick up the kids. The kids saw him hundreds and hundreds of times. He was loved by the whole community. There are stories about how he would go to the widow's house to build furniture for her. He did lots of things to just help people. He was always helping everyone. Well, a few months later, some things started to happen. Now, I want to go back to what I said at the beginning. If you can create shame, you can buy silence. And if you can buy silence, you can create chaos. And if you have chaos, you can control everyone. So B, he seduced Marianne and Bob. They both had sexual encounters with Bob that first fall that they knew each other, and nobody wanted to talk about it. Everybody distanced themselves from each other. And this was actually a strategic move on B's part. Now, when Abducted in Plain Sight came out, there was such a disservice to how they had the telling of what went down with Bob and how he had an affair, a momentary sexual experience with B. And there were a lot of really unfortunate memes, and there was just a lot of mockery of what happened. This is so sad because if we actually look at how strategic B was and what a psychopath will actually do, it would be so much better if we looked at the story and we said, wow, how could somebody have convinced someone to do that? And if he did convince someone to do that, that tells us a whole lot more about B and his character. And I just want to commend the Brobergs. Bob is gone now, and I don't think Marianne will see this, but this is me publicly saying, let's not create lots of shame when these people have come forward and they have shared something so vulnerably because they want you and they want me and they want everybody in the world to understand the insane lengths that predators will go to be able to divide and conquer. So these encounters happened. And if you want to kind of see more accurately how all of that went down, a friend of the family on Peacock paints the picture much better. It's much more understandable how they got to that place if you watch that. Okay. So anyway, the Berchtolds are doing double dates with the Brobergs. They're spending tons and tons of time together. Now, before we move on, I really want to highlight some things from Mormon theology and culture that kind of explain what was going on there. So homosexuality is definitely treated as one of the most egregious sins, just a terrible, terrible thing within Mormonism. So the fact that B was able to convince Bob to do something, it meant that Bob would be really pushed to the edge of society if anybody knew what he had done. Also in Mormonism, it's taught that sexual sin is second only to murder. That's right. It is worse for you to have consensual relations as an adult. If you're not married, then it is for you to, kidnap someone. Let's just think about that. So anyway, shame and purity culture can absolutely breed that kind of shame that buys the silence, and that silence makes it so that predators go unchecked. Now, this is something that is a big issue in the ex-Mormon community. We talk about this quite a bit when it comes to the Arizona clergy privilege. Arizona clergy privilege is something that the LDS Church fought for in 2023 that makes it so that they do not have to report sexual predators to police if they come and confess to their clergy. And so this is a huge, huge issue back in the 70s, and I would argue that it continues to be an issue today. So let's just acknowledge the elephant in the room, that sexual shame can be a thing that can buy lots of silence. So the Brobergs, like I said, it's very honest of them to be so brave and share the real tactics that B used against their family to divide them. The shame in this story belongs to B. The shame in the story does not belong to Marianne, and the shame in the story does not belong to Bob. The villain in this story is B. Let's remember that. Okay, so they all got extremely close individually to B, but not necessarily, and yes, it seemed collectively, but not really. He was dividing everybody off. He was manipulating them. He was distracting them. He was creating emotional distance between them, and he was controlling them. So before we get into this next part, this is why I say if you don't know Mormonism, you don't know this story. See, there is some space theology within Mormonism that I believe was the foundation for what B was able to use as a launch point. Now, there were also culturally some things, and we'll talk about those too. If you've ever seen the episode of Ancient Aliens about Mormonism, there's an argument that it was the aliens, right? And so there's an episode of Ancient Aliens that talks about how God and Jesus came down in a pillar of light. And oh my gosh, where have we seen pillars of light? UFOs, right? Space. Pillars of light are what people travel down from UFOs from. And so maybe God and Jesus came from that. Now, I want to be clear, this is not coming from the Mormon Church. This is coming from Ancient Aliens, the TV show. That's, I think, entertainment-based, right? Also, there's another pop culture reference to this. In the Book of Mormon musical, there's the song I Believe, and he talks about how I believe that I can get my own planet.
Your own planet?
The church has retorted this and said, well, we don't believe that you can get your own planet. But they don't go on to mention that they believe that you will progress until you achieve godhood. And when you achieve godhood, you're going to be able to create your own worlds without end. So do you get your own planet? No. You make your own planet. All right. So there's that piece. Additionally, in Mormonism, there is the belief that God lives on a planet near a star called Kolob. Okay. And on this planet, near the star Kolob, it means that like God literally would kind of be like an extraterrestrial if you think about it that way. I don't think that any Mormons would be like, oh yeah, we believe God's an alien. But you can see how someone would believe that. Oh, he lives on another planet. Oh, he's a being on another planet. Oh, aliens, right? Okay, so there's that connection. Additionally, Joseph Smith talked about how there were people that lived on the moon who dressed like Quakers. And Jesus is the savior of many planets, according to Mormon theology. God created worlds without end, and that lots of those planets are populated. And there's this idea that he's going to connect the four corners of the earth, and everybody, will be saved, and Jesus will come again, and the second coming will happen. Could it be maybe the four corners of the universe? I don't know. B kind of made it sound like that when he would talk about these things, because he would run into the house anytime there was a UFO sighting. He would run into the Broberg's house, and he would, in front of Jan, start talking to Marianne about, oh my goodness, could this be the literal gathering of Israel? Could the aliens be coming together to gather their tribes so that we can have the literal gathering of Israel? Now, what is the literal gathering of Israel? According to Mormon doctrine, there is what's called the Articles of Faith. And Article of Faith number 10 says, we believe in the literal gathering of Israel and in the restoration of the 10 tribes, and that Zion, the New Jerusalem, will be built upon the American continent, and that Christ will reign personally upon the earth, and that the earth will be renewed and receive its paradisical glory. So here's the thing I want you to think about. If there is a literal gathering of Israel, B is saying that the aliens are coming to gather the tribes in front of Jan. This is a thing that is founded and supported by her religion, by her theology, according to the way that he's talking about it. He also would take the kids after school to a place that was called the Home of the Space Burger, and they would have these hamburgers that were put into almost like a sandwich press, and so they were shaped like a UFO. And he had the kids engrossed in UFOs constantly. The space race was going on between the United States and Russia until 1975. Remember, the story began in 1972. We're still in the middle of that. So culturally, that's happening. There's alien movies, and he takes every opportunity to take the kids to go see alien movies. There are hundreds of activities with this man. So I want you to think about somebody that you've seen hundreds of times, that you trust implicitly and explicitly. There's no question. That was B. Like I mentioned before, he was very handy. He did lots of projects for people in the community. So when Jan wanted her own room, he built a wall between Jan and Karen in their bedroom so that Jan could have her own room. And, you know, that was just such a fun, exciting thing. Nobody thought anything of it at the time. He also would always make sure that Jan had her allergy pills because gosh, she just had the worst allergies and she needed those allergy pills. So there's 19 months of this, of just relationship building, of becoming close, of exposure to alien ideas, lots of different things like this. And unbeknownst to the Brobergs, at the end of those 19 months in January 1974, B, he received some church discipline for grooming a young girl, and nobody knew. Nobody knew. So he went to therapy in California for it. He had mentioned something to Bob about how he had been assaulted by somebody when he was 4, and so he needed therapy and he needed to work on healing from it. The girl was, I believe, about Jan's age, from what I understood in his story, which this very well may have just been a story. So let's say that. So he goes to California and he sees a therapist, and the therapist gives him some tapes and says that in order for you to heal, you need to lay next to a girl who's about the age that the girl was who did this to you. And you need to listen to these tapes 4 times a week for 6 months. So he went to the Brobergs and he said, guys, I really need your help to be able to heal from this in order to get better. And he asked for permission to lay with Jan. And the parents were uncomfortable with it, but they wanted their friend to get better. And so they gave him permission. And they never thought he would do anything to Jan. So he would lay next to her 4 times a week for 6 months. And he gave her sleeping pills disguised as allergy pills. And he did things to her. She didn't have any clear understanding, memory, or recollection of that until later when things started to make sense. 10 months later, October 17th, 1974, Jan had piano lessons, and B said he wanted to take her for a horse ride out in American Falls. And he asked Jan's parents. Bob said no. Marianne reluctantly came around and she was like, okay, but just make sure that she's home before dinner. Make sure that she's here before Bob gets home. I don't want him to be upset. So he takes her. He gives her the allergy pill because obviously they're going out with horses. That's going to be super important. And Jan would wake up sometime later, a significant time later, drugged and chained to a mattress in a motorhome. She ended up hearing a voice over a speaker box that was next to her. It sounded almost alien. It sounded like an alien, like we've talked about, that he had put in front of her so many times. And this alien was telling her that they were 2 aliens, Zeta and Zethra. And Zeta and Zethra, they were from a planet, and they wanted Jan to know that she was also an alien like them. Well, half alien. See, her mom was her mom, but the alien that was her father, well, she didn't know him. And so her dad, Bob, was kind of like Joseph was to Jesus. He was taking care of a child that was from a being that wasn't from this planet. And so he ended up, she ended up hearing this voice saying lots of things and explaining to her that she had a mission. She had a really important mission, and that there was a dying planet that depended on her. And she had to see this mission through in order for this planet to be saved. And that mission was, she was to, before her 16th birthday, have a baby with the male companion that she would find at the front of the motorhome. She slipped in and out of consciousness for a while, and eventually she ended up waking up one time, and she wasn't chained down anymore. She goes up to the front of the motorhome, and she sees B there, and she understands he is the male companion. He has blood on him. He tells her this crazy story about how there was this crazy bright light that came, and he thinks that they got abducted and they've been put in this place, and what are they going to do? And so she tells him about how they have this mission, and she's, really uncomfortable with it, but she's supposed to have a baby with him. He ends up taking some books out and shows her, all of these books about how babies are made. And over the time there, he did assault her. He assaulted her many times, but he did it very subtly, and he did it in a way that would not necessarily leave evidence. And she would just look up through the window in the roof of the motorhome at the leaves, and she would just focus on the leaves and just dissociate from how traumatic this experience was. They did lots of other things. They went out and played on the water. They had a good time, but he, it turns out, had taken her to Mexico. He took her to a remote area in Mexico, and he also, unbeknownst to her, had paid some people to pose as her and him and get a Mexican marriage license so that they were married. You might be thinking, why would she just do whatever the aliens said? See, there were consequences to this. They said that if she ever, touched another man besides the male companion, or if she didn't see this mission through and she didn't have a baby with the male companion by her 16th birthday, her dad would die. Her sister would go blind. Her other sister would have to take her place on this mission, and Jan's soul would be vaporized. So her eternal soul that she had been taught about, that, the most important thing is the eternal progression of her soul, according to Mormonism, her eternal soul would be vaporized. And this terrified her. It kept her awake at night. It scared her so, so bad. Meanwhile, back in Pocatello, while all of this is going down, remember this started on October 17th, Gail, B's wife, had begged the Brobergs, please don't tell the authorities. I'm sure he'll be back. See, B had a bipolar diagnosis, which, as somebody with a bipolar diagnosis, it ticks me off that he would use that type of diagnosis to cover up the horrible things that he was doing. Just got to say that. Gail begged them not to alert authorities. And on October 21st, 1974, finally the Brobergs said, Gail, I am sorry, we have to alert the authorities. And it was 4 days later. The FBI quickly got involved, and the FBI, for your frame of reference, it's very easy for us to pass lots of judgment on the Broberg family because of this whole story when we hear it all. But when you realize that the FBI did not know the word pedophile, it puts into perspective how foreign the idea was that this might even be a thing. So this FBI agent who was put on this case, he learned about pedophiles for the first time, and it was a disturbing experience. It was a traumatizing experience for him, as for everybody involved. While B was in Mexico, he called his brother Joe, who lived in Utah, and said, I want you to tell them that I will bring Jan back if they will give me permission to marry her in the United States. I've already married her in Mexico, but I need their permission to marry her in the United States so that I don't go to jail. And the Brobergs were like, no, we're not going to give this man permission to marry our 12-year-old. I think I did the math, and he was like in his 40s. And so anyway, the FBI was like, yeah, we're not doing that, but we're going to tap Joe's phone line. So they tapped Joe's phone line, and they were able to track down where B was calling from when he called the next time. And they found the location in Mexico, and they were able to track down the missing motorhome that B had. And so the federales, they went and they arrested B, and they took Jan into custody as well. Jan didn't know what was going on. She was just terrified. You know, she saw B getting arrested. And so she went into the jail as well. And she was staying there, and he was staying at a different part of the jail while they were waiting for Jan's family to arrive. Jan's just terrified. She doesn't know what's going to happen. But eventually, the Brobergs, they made it down. They got Jan out of that prison, but not before B got to Jan. B got to her by bribing one of the guards in the jail, and B ended up giving his gold ring to him. And so the guard brought Jan to B, and B told her that you can't talk about 4 things. Number 1, you can't talk about Zeta and Zethra. Number 2, you can't talk about the relaxing pills that you take. Number 3, you can't talk about the mission. And so number 4, since you can't talk about the mission, you can't talk about anything that we've done physically. And so she knew that this was the most important thing. This dying alien planet depended on her to not talk about these 4 things. And so when her family came, she just played it all off. Yeah, I just had lots of fun with B. We had a great time. And so Mary Ann took Jan to a doctor who did a pelvic exam. He said that her hymen had not been broken, and so there was no concern about anything beyond that. So a few months passed, or a few weeks passed actually, and on Christmas Eve, Gail Berchtold came to the Brobergs, and she said to them, now, I have some affidavits for you to sign saying that you gave B permission to take Jan to Mexico. Otherwise, I'm going to expose the affair that Mary Ann had, and I'm going to expose that Bob is a homosexual. And so eventually, the Brobergs gave in, and they signed the affidavits, and that killed the FBI's case against B. The FBI agent was understandably extremely upset. So the FBI also had said to the Brobergs that they needed to keep a distance from the Berchtolds. Their kids were not to play together. They were not to see B. They were not to interact with the Berchtolds in any way. And they didn't listen. Mary Ann actually was convinced by B that he had kidnapped Jan to try to be close to Mary Ann, because B was just so upset that he couldn't be with Mary Ann because Mary Ann was married to Bob. And so he had kidnapped Jan because she was the next best thing. B and Mary Ann, they would begin a relationship and an affair that would last for several months. See, Mary Ann and B were having this affair, and Bob found out about it. And so when he found out that not only was this affair happening, but Mary Ann was giving B access to Jan throughout the affair, he ended up filing for divorce and sole custody of Jan. And that was just a crazy thing that happened, that all of a sudden, Marianne's whole world is coming apart, and she ends up realizing the mistakes she made, and she ends up coming back to Bob, and she cuts B out completely. Summer of 1976, B bought a family fun center in Wyoming, and Jan wanted to work there. And she actually left home for 2 weeks. And after 2 weeks, she was forced to come home because her dad was not thrilled with her being in Wyoming with the man who had kidnapped her. And so she comes home, and there's lots of tension. Nobody's happy. Everybody's really angry about this situation in various ways. As far as Jan is really upset with her dad. Her dad is, super worried because, how has this man got so much control over my daughter? All of these different things. So then at the end of the summer, August 10th, 1976, Marianne and Bob, they found this letter. It said, "Dear Bob and Marianne, you won't let me do what's right, so I'll do what's wrong. I'm leaving without B and do not plan on coming back until you accept me as me. I cannot accept your religion or your screwed up morals. I just want to be me and have B. Please, before all of us are destroyed, let me go." Now, there were various phone calls from B that came in during this period of time saying that Jan just wanted to marry B, and she would come home and she would see them again if they would just give permission for this grown man to marry this teenager. Jan ran away, but it was found that, she had been kidnapped out the window. B had been standing outside the window and had told her what to write. He took her to a private school in California and posed as a CIA agent, saying that they were refugees from the Lebanon crisis. And if anybody comes here, those are the bad guys. So he put her in under a fake name. And so that meant that if and when the FBI got there, this school assumed that these were the bad guys and they needed to lie to them about Jan being there. The FBI ended up tapping and recording every single call at the Brobergs for those months. B psychologically was torturing and manipulating them through those calls. He was saying things about how Jan was now a sex worker and how Jan was getting her money a hard way, and Jan was doing drugs, and Jan was doing lots and lots of crazy things. And they knew not to believe him, but there was also that fear in them that, what if it is true? I apologize. I said before that he went to prison in 1975. He went in 1976 for those 10 days. And finally, through those phone calls, they were able to track where he was making the phone calls from. And there was a phone booth. And in this phone booth, they saw that he had gone into this phone booth and he had made a call. It wasn't to the Brobergs. And so there was also a phone book in there. They go in and they see that there's written in the phone book a phone number. They call it, and it's for a private school for girls in California. So the FBI detained B. They went to his motorhome and they found posters of Jan. There were pictures of Jan, poster size, all over his house, as if it was some sort of, altar of worship to Jan. So they go to the school, and the school naturally thinks that the FBI is the bad guys, and they were able to finally explain the situation and get Jan. B was detained for breaking federal parole, and then January 24th, 1977, a few months later after B has been detained, Bob Broberg, he owned a flower shop in Pocatello, Idaho. His flower shop and half of that block burned down. And it turns out that there were two men who said that B had promised to pay them $1,000 a month for life if they burned it down. But there was no way to prove that B was the one actually behind it. Jan was terrified because B had said that her dad would die, and it seemed that he almost had, but he made it. And he stood outside hugging his daughters and hugging his wife, saying, "Don't worry, let it burn, let it burn." these four things that I'm holding right now. The four of you are the only people and the only things in this whole world that matter to me. Several months later, June 1977, Berchtold was acquitted for that second kidnapping for insanity. He would serve 6 months in a mental health facility. And those 6 months, I hope and I think that those helped to buy Jan several months of, being able to distance herself from his mind control. Because in July 31st, her birthday, 1978, she went out with a boy. Remember, Zeta and Zethra had told her that she needed to never be near any other male ever. And so this was a hint of that mind control starting to slip. She goes out on an ice cream date, and he had touched her hand in the process of giving her the ice cream, and she was so afraid. And then her dog got sick, and it seemed like the dog wasn't going to make it, and she knew that it was her fault. And so she realized that she had to save her sister Karen, and she needed to take her own life and Karen's before they would end up being vaporized for not being able to fulfill the mission. So she got a gun and she was ready to do it. But the next day, the dog was better. And she realized, wait a minute, I'm alive, even though the mission wasn't fulfilled. My dad's alive, even though the mission wasn't fulfilled. Susan isn't blind. Could this whole thing be a lie? And she finally knew. It had all been an act. And she just broke down sobbing. And it took her about 2 hours to tell about the 15 minutes of information that she needed to tell her parents about what really happened. Jan went on to say that she had probably about 200 sexual encounters with B in those years. You might be wondering where everybody is today. B was excommunicated from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. However, Jan was living in Florida when she received a call saying there's a man named Bob Berchtold who wants to have his membership reinstated, and he wants to get married in the temple, and we need to have you write a letter saying that he can. And she said, I will write a letter, but it will not be saying that he's a good man. And so she wrote a letter about what a predator he was. She also went on to write a book with her mom, Marianne, in 2004 called Stolen Innocence, the Jan Broberg story. She ended up finding out that B had 7 victims that we know of. And there has also been Abducted in Plain Sight, telling her story on Netflix, and much better telling of her story on Peacock, A Friend of the Family. She refers to herself as a liberal Mormon, and she had gotten married. She lived out her dream of being an actress. She has kids. She is one of the kindest humans you'll ever meet. She is amazing. So she has also gone on to be an advocate for child sex abuse survivors. And she started the Jan Broberg Foundation and has a program called Thrivivors, helping survivors to thrive after healing from something horrific. So B was sentenced to a year in prison for an assault of advocates who were at an event that Jan was at. And before he went to prison, he took his own life. So if you've suffered sexual abuse at the hands of a church member or a friend of your family or anyone, links in the description for the Jan Broberg Foundation are there. Or if you've suffered at the hands of a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and you want to put pressure on the church to fix the policies and put an end to things like the Arizona clergy privilege, there is a link for LDS abuse, justice, and numbers in the description as well. So here's my question for you. Will you commit to like, rate, review, subscribe, or comment on your platform of choice to make the angel with the flaming sword happy? He'll be sure to remind you to come back next week for another Mormon True Crime.